Tito Santana just revealed the names of 4 wrestlers he absolutely couldn't stand. And honestly, we're shocked. The backstage drama behind these stories is wild. And once you hear what really went down with Tito, you'll be just as stunned. So let's dive right into it. 1. Playably Blanchard. It all started during the mid-1980s, when both men were rising names in the wrestling world. Tito had already made a name for himself as a workhorse in the WWF, a dependable babyface who gave everything in the ring and always carried himself with humility. Meanwhile, Tully Blanchard was carving his reputation in the NWA, and later as one of the infamous Four Horsemen, a group known not just for their talent, but also for their arrogance and sense of superiority. When their paths crossed, Tito instantly felt that Tully carried that same arrogance off camera too. In Tito's eyes, Tully wasn't just playing a cocky character, he was that character. He reportedly treated some of the locker room staff and even fellow wrestlers with a lack of respect, something that didn't sit well with a man like Tito, who had been raised on old-school wrestling values of respect and professionalism. Things got worse when they worked near each other on shows and events. Tito once mentioned in interviews that Tully had a disrespectful attitude that rubbed many people the wrong way. He felt that Tully thought he was above others, acting like he was doing everyone a favor just by showing up. Santana wasn't someone who liked drama, but he made it clear he didn't appreciate how Tully treated others behind the scenes. The tension between them wasn't about a storyline or title. It was personal. It was about 2 completely different approaches to the wrestling business, one built on humility, the other on ego. Tito avoided direct confrontation, but he never held back when asked about Tully in later years. He openly said he didn't like him and found him disrespectful, which is rare for someone like Santana, who almost never badmouthed anyone publicly. Over the years, nothing really changed between them. They never reconciled, and Tito never softened his stance. Even decades later, when asked about his least favorite people in the business, Tully's name always came up. It wasn't about bitterness, it was about principle. Tito simply couldn't respect someone who, in his view, lacked respect for others. 2. Shawn Michaels. Their issues didn't start in the ring. In fact, Tito actually respected Shawn's talent. He even said he enjoyed wrestling him because Shawn could make any match look great. But the problem was what happened outside the ring. Shawn's ego, his growing reputation for being difficult, and his attitude toward other wrestlers were things Tito just couldn't ignore. One of the most talked about moments between them happened on an airplane. During their WWF days in the early 1990s, according to Tito, it started as just another flight home after a series of shows, but things quickly turned ugly. Shawn, still in his rebellious, wild phase, was acting out, loud, disrespectful, and clearly feeling untouchable because of his rising status. Tito, who had always carried himself as a professional and veteran, called him out on his behavior. That's when the situation escalated. Words were exchanged, voices got louder, and soon enough it turned into a full-blown backstage altercation mid-flight. Santana, who rarely lost his temper, was furious. He wasn't someone who picked fights, but he also wasn't going to sit quietly while someone disrespected others. People around them had to step in before it got completely out of hand. After that moment, things between Tito and Shawn were never the same. Tito made it clear that he had no problem with Shawn's ability as a performer, but he couldn't stand the arrogance and the way Shawn treated people around him during that era. He saw it as a lack of gratitude and humility, 2 things Tito valued deeply. To be fair, Shawn later admitted that he wasn't proud of who he was back then. He struggled with ego, fame, and personal demons that made him hard to be around. But for Tito, those experiences stuck. In interviews years later, he didn't sugarcoat it. He said that Shawn's backstage attitude was terrible, even though he respected his in-ring talent. The irony is that both men came from very different generations of wrestling. Tito was old school, shake hands, respect your opponents, do your job. Shawn was from the new guard, flashier, edgier, and more rebellious. Their airplane confrontation was just a small glimpse of a much bigger culture clash happening in wrestling at the time. 3. Assaults Bruiser Brody. When Tito Santana looks back on his wrestling career, He often speaks with pride about traveling the world, performing for fans everywhere from the United States to Mexico to Japan. But when the topic of Japan comes up, Tito's tone changes. He admitted that his time wrestling there wasn't exactly his favorite experience, and part of that discomfort came from dealing with some of the intense, unpredictable personalities in that territory. One of the names that always seems to surface in those conversations is Bruiser Brody. Now, Bruiser Brody was a legend, a wild, larger-than-life brawler who was both feared and respected wherever he went. Fans adored his chaos. Promoters feared it. He was known for doing things his way, whether that meant refusing to lose, changing match finishes on the fly, or scaring the life out of his opponents with real punches and kicks. To many wrestlers, he was a test of toughness. But for a guy like Tito Santana, who built his career on professionalism, cooperation, and mutual respect, that kind of behavior was hard to stomach. Tito didn't have a long, personal feud with Brody, but his dislike came from experiences and stories that shaped how he saw him. During his tours in Japan, Tito saw firsthand how brutal the environment was. It wasn't just about wrestling skill, it was about survival. Wrestlers like Brody ruled the locker room with intimidation. If they didn't like you, or if you didn't show them enough respect, they could make your life miserable in the ring. Tito, who always tried to maintain order and respect, found that kind of chaos draining. He once mentioned in interviews that his time in Japan wasn't enjoyable, not because of the fans, but because of how intense and sometimes toxic the atmosphere could be backstage. Many wrestlers from that era confirmed that Bruiser Brody was one of the most difficult men to deal with. He had no problem standing up to promoters, refusing orders, or even walking out mid-tour if he felt disrespected. To Tito, that wasn't confidence. It was unnecessary drama. There's also the cultural clash to consider. Tito came from the WWF environment, where things were tightly structured, matches were planned, and professionalism was key. Japan, especially during Brody's era, was raw and unpredictable. You might be scheduled to work with someone like Brody, but the match could turn real in an instant if he felt you weren't keeping up. For Tito, who valued teamwork in the ring, that style of wrestling went completely against his principles. Over time, Tito made peace with the fact that Japan, and people like Brody, just weren't for him. He respected Brody's success and understood why fans loved his wild aura, but he couldn't admire how he treated others or how he carried himself professionally. To Tito, wrestling was about giving fans a great show without ego or intimidation. 4. Bob Orton. In his early days, Tito looked up to Orton. Bob had that old-school aura, the kind of guy who carried himself like a real cowboy, proud, strong, and sometimes intimidating. He wasn't the easiest trainer to deal with, but he was one of the best. Orton pushed his students hard because he believed the wrestling business demanded toughness and discipline. Tito respected that at first. He learned a lot about in-ring psychology and timing from Orton, and for a while everything seemed fine. But somewhere along the way, cracks began to form. Tito started to notice that Orton's way of teaching, and his attitude outside the ring, could be harsh, even disrespectful at times. There were moments when Orton's criticism crossed from tough love into outright condescension. Tito, who had always carried himself with humility, didn't appreciate being talked down to, especially after he'd already begun establishing himself as a capable performer. As Tito's career took off, especially in the WWF, his relationship with Orton became more strained. There wasn't one dramatic falling out. It was more like years of small slights and misunderstandings that built up over time. Tito once hinted that some of his early trainers didn't always believe in him or treat him with the respect he earned later in his career. While he didn't name Orton directly in every account, it was clear that their bond had soured. To make things even more complex, both men found themselves crossing paths again in the WWF during the 1980s. By then, Tito was an established star, while Orton had made his mark as Roddy Piper's bodyguard and one of the most recognizable heels on the roster. The dynamic between them wasn't that of a student and teacher anymore. It was two veterans who had grown apart. Tito was calm and professional. Orton was brash and sarcastic. That difference in personality kept a quiet distance between them. Still, it's worth noting that Tito never spoke about Bob Orton with outright hate. It was more of a lingering disappointment. He respected Orton's skill, acknowledged what he learned from him, but didn't look back fondly on their personal relationship. In wrestling, some bonds built early on never quite heal because egos, pride, and differing values get in the way. So while Tito Santana may not have despised Bob Orton the way he did someone like Tully Blanchard, there was definitely unresolved tension there, the kind that comes from a mentorship that went sour, leaving behind respect for the wrestler, but not necessarily for the man. And that wraps up today's video. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you in the next one. See you soon.